Look, the part of it that troubles me the most is not only what he wants to do or what he would do, but how he sells it to the American people. And he sells it with, hey, you know what, we need to stop, focusing on other countries, and we need to focus on our country, right? It's all about us. And he's quoted as saying that, and I think it resonates with a lot of people because they're angry. They know that we've been at war for decades now. And so when they hear that he wants to disband NATO or doesn't want to protect certain countries that are part of NATO, well, other, people who vote for him are like, yeah, why are we supporting them? Why are we wasting our time with other countries when we can focus on our own country?
Ted Cruz gave a speech last night where he most notably did not actually endorse the man who invited him to speak at the convention, and the reaction during the speech was not positive. And the reaction in the 24 hours since then has been even worse, perhaps, for Ted Cruz. Conservatives very angry. Here is a brief sampling.
Start with Ted Cruz that we know in Washington, D.C., who is a self-absorbed, narcissistic individual. It's all about Ted Cruz. America now knows that. He's now a small man who is not with the Republican Party.
Ted Cruz showed America what he really is. He's a fraud, he's a liar, he's self-centered, and he disqualified himself for ever being considered for president of the United States.
It was an awful, selfish speech by someone who tonight, through the words he said on that stage, showed everybody why he has richly earned the reputation that he has on Capitol Hill.
Last night, Ted Cruz did the impossible. He turned Donald Trump into a victim.
When he was circling the runway, we all thought he was going to land the plane. Instead, he crashed it. It was an absolutely dishonorable moment.
I don't understand how someone can present themselves as a person of integrity and then come into this room tonight and give that cute speech he gave.
And he's not a true Republican, he's not a true conservative, he's totally self-centered. Tonight, I never saw such outrage and anger on the floor as I saw Ted Cruz tonight, and he deserved every bit of it. He's a total fraud.
What Ted Cruz did last night, I was astonished. I'm extremely disappointed in him.
He earned his moniker last night that Donald Trump had attributed to him, Lying Ted. There's a new Broadway play, Lion King 2. It's going to be opening up on Broadway.
Yeah, I just think it was an awful performance by someone who showed himself tonight to not be a man of his word.
They gave him enough rope to hang himself, and he followed through on that.
He dishonored himself and the convention. I'm absolutely disgusted with what he did last night.
All right, I think this has hurt him profoundly. I think this has done lasting damage.
This is possibly the most Cuban thing he could have done. He's Cuban-American. It's a pride thing.
Ted Cruz moves self-absorbed.
It's not so much his message we disagree with, it's him as a human being and as a person.
Ted Cruz, the self-absorbed, narcissistic individual.
Disgraced himself, disgraced the party, and the party should never consider him again for office.
They know now Ted Cruz, the self-absorbed individual.
We can live without Ted Cruz, and I think it's good that America saw what Ted Cruz is all about.
He's ended his own career.
Jeez. Okay, so coming out of that, the only good news is that if you're a fan of Lion King, there is a second one. It's going to be on Broadway. I can't wait to see it.
That's such a Cuban joke.
Yeah, I know. Stop being so Cuban. God damn it.
It's going to hurt Huckabee next time he runs for president.
Exactly.
So I can't understand, though, how'd they feel about it?
Yeah, how'd they feel?
Yeah, how'd that go over in the Republican Party?
Lion.
Brilliant. I talked before we came on with someone who worked for the Cruz campaign. I was just walking in the hottest city in America with someone who worked on the Cruz campaign. The Cruz people have been waiting for this for a long time. The people that were in the trenches with him, that wanted Ted Cruz to attack Donald Trump a lot earlier than he did, who didn't want him to, sort of lay over. The other thing to remember about Ted Cruz that I looked up again today because I had forgotten it. He's 45 years old.
Yeah.
Right? He's young. His politics are not that of a 45-year-old. But he doesn't care about this election now. He doesn't even care perhaps about 2020. He could look at 24, 28, 32 and not have to worry about what he's saying and doing here. He stood up for himself and
Michael, his career is over.
What?
Yeah, his career's over. They made that sense. It's over.
That's all that he's
Was that
done.
Huckabee saying that, by the way?
Yeah.
Huckabee.
No,
It was everybody.
Peter King said it.
Oh, Peter King said that. Oh, well, he's at least still
Do you remember Peter King was going to run for office this year? Like he was
he was going to be number 18.
Number 18. So to set the stage a little bit more, we want to show you this picture. It's a screenshot of the Trump family while the speech was going on. If you can see the faces, Donald Trump looks extremely unhappy. That is actually just how he looks. But his son is not happy during this speech. He was not a fan.
Were they were in their seats?
Yes, that's them in their seats.
My understanding is that Trump came in the middle of the speech. That it was like a WWE moment. Like, as he's speaking, Trump starts to... Roland Martin was telling me about this. I was interviewing him on TYT Interviews. Check that out on youtube.com/TYT Interviews. And he said he was in the room, and all of a sudden the entire room pivoted and looked in the opposite direction of Ted Cruz. He's like, what in the world's going on? Is there a fight? He looks and he's like, oh my God, Donald Trump just walked in. So Donald Trump, having seen the speech ahead of time, but only a little bit ahead of time, decided, oh, you're going to Bigfoot me? No, I'm going to Bigfoot you. And then the New York delegation is the one that starts to chant of endorse Trump, endorse Trump.
Yeah.
Now, I talked to somebody in the New York delegation last night, and they said, yes, Trump met with us beforehand, but no, he did not tell us to boo him or anything along those lines. But now, remember, he might have told a couple of people in the New York delegation, not everybody, and then they're the ones who precipitated this whole thing.
Yeah.
But they did not have a lot of time before Cruz's speech, because Cruz gave a speech, I think, at the last minute. So they by the time...
Empty your mind, formless, shapeless, like water. I want to flow. I want to crash. Welcome to the Bruce Lee Podcast, a podcast about Bruce Lee's life and philosophy. Hey guys, I'm Shannon Lee. I am the daughter of Bruce Lee, but I am also the CEO of the Bruce Lee Family Company, which looks after my father's legacy, and I'm also sit on the board of the Bruce Lee Foundation, which is our public charity. And we're doing this podcast because I really wanted to have the opportunity to share my father's philosophy with a new generation of people who maybe aren't as familiar with his philosophy, and for those of you who know a little bit, maybe take it a little deeper and get an opportunity to dig into it and talk about it a little bit. So this is episode 2 of our podcast, Be Water, My Friend. And I'm also here with Sharon Lee. Hi! My friend and co-host here on the podcast, and she also works with us at the Bruce Lee Family Company.
Yes, I do. I am the Chief Creative Officer and CMO, and this is a great experiment, and we're super excited to just talk about it because, you know, it's actually just a sharing of something that we naturally do at the office, where we're always just like investigating and talking about and questioning, and also just trying to learn and find out more. And as Shannon said, you know, what's interesting about Bruce Lee's philosophy is that he died over 40 years ago, but there's this whole new generation of young people who are super attracted to the philosophy and are finding the philosophy through social media, or Facebook, or Twitter, and really connecting to it. So we've been watching that happen for the last few years. So we just thought, because they're just kind of getting the tip of the iceberg with the quotes and the images, that it would be really nice and helpful to, you know, break it down and just unpack it, because sometimes it can be a little dense and complicated. So since we have the living heiress here, I mean, what a great opportunity to learn more. So I wanted to ask you, Shannon, I mean, I wanted to start with, you know, one of your dad's most famous quotes. It's longer, and we'll kind of play the whole clip for you, but it ends in, "Be water, my friend." Mm-hmm. And it's famous because we have audio and video of Bruce Lee, you know, kind of saying this, but it's also this kind of incredible metaphor that has, I want to say, like, you know, so many other philosophical ideas kind of jam-packed in it. So we wanted to start today with "Be Water, My Friend," and so first let's hear the clip of it so that you guys can understand and know it.
Empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. Now you put water into a cup.
becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow, or it can crash. Be water, my friend.
You know, that quote is so beautiful and poetic, and the way that your dad says it carries this kind of incredible momentum and energy. But if you don't understand what he means by be water, my friend, and the larger metaphor, let's try to kind of break it down so that we can understand. So the first thing he says is empty your mind. So let's just start there. You know, let's have you tell us, what does he mean by this?
Well, you know, I'm sure everybody has this experience. I know I do in our daily lives. A lot of times we have inner dialogue going on all the time. We're thinking about things. We're turning things over in our head. Should I say this? Should I do this? What did he mean by that? Da, 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 da. And so our minds can be very busy. And, you know, my father, the very first thing he says is empty your mind, because he wants you to be in a state where you're open to receive. You turn all of that clutter down, push it to the side, and really make yourself neutral and available and open to receive whatever is happening in the present moment, whatever anyone's going to do or say, or you're going to do or say, so that you're in a place where you're able to really receive in a non-judging way. You want to turn off the inner critic. You want to turn all of that off and just be this empty vessel that is ready to take in whatever's in front of you.
So that's funny, because in America, some people might think as an empty head as being like a dummy. Or somebody who like doesn't have knowledge, right? Because we are in a place and time where the actual acquisition of knowledge is very important, just having a lot of data and facts in your head. But you're saying that in this context, when your dad was saying empty your mind, it's about neutrality?
It's really about heightened awareness, if you want to put it that way. It's actually a very active thing, right? Because it's hard, first of all, to turn all of those voices down and keep yourself in a very non-judgmental, open place, yet very aware. You're ready, you're listening, you're not tense, you're not, aggravated in any way, but it's actually neutrality in a very hyper-present way, in a very with awareness. So it's not passive, actually.
So meaning that you're really actively trying not to judge yourself or the situation, because that takes so much effort. You're just trying to get there and be, kind of aware of that.
Right, and also your judgments limit the experience, right? Because if you already put a framework around it and you say like, oh, this person's going to say this thing and it's going to be really dumb, then that's what you're going to hear. You're going to hear something dumb, right?
Right.
But if you let that go, if you just say, I'm not going to judge it, I'm just going to make myself super open to the experience or the words or whatever it is, then you can really take it in and say, does this hit me in a certain way? Does this resonate with me?
Okay, well, see, we just talked a lot just about the first 3 words, which is why this is like, it's almost like trying to understand a poem, because he was a poet, and, he is very poetic in his speech, so it has this feeling, but it has this, really kind of jam-packedness about it, and so I'm glad you clarified that. Neutrality, but active awareness, hyper-awareness. The other thing that kind of I noticed that comes through is about this water being kind of a metaphor for life, as this kind of moving, ever-evolving process. Can you kind of explain what you think, what he meant?
Well, life is a process, right? From the moment you're born till the moment that you pass away, it's really nonstop activity, right? I mean, you have so many experiences, and you do so many things, and if you step back and look at life, you can almost look at it as a river that's flowing, right? And that you're in the current of. And so my father really used water as a metaphor for living, real active living. And, he would say, you don't want to be stale. You don't want to get stale. You want to keep on flowing, right? And the idea of that, if you think of water as a metaphor for life, when water is stagnant, what happens to it, right? It stops, it can start growing algae, it can get disease in it, it can not be drinkable, it cannot support life anymore, and ultimately at some point maybe it just evaporates or just turns into sludge, right? And so the idea is that water in its natural state always has some movement to it, even if it's a very slow movement, even if it's just a slow drip, you know, forging away at a rock over time. It's constantly moving, and that life should be a flowing process. And if you find yourself getting stuck, then you need to take a look at that and find another way to flow around that obstacle.
Yeah, and also he describes all of the different ways that water can be almost, so that, you know, this is the form that it takes is also not static. So sometimes you're solid, sometimes you're a trickling stream. And so he must have, you know, had occasion in his own life where these kinds of ideas really helped him get through his obstacles. So you think of, you know, just, you know, he had this incredible life. He had a family. He was a young guy, Asian American in Hollywood at a time when that wasn't common. You know, how would he use this philosophy to just kind of get through, if you can tell us a story?
Yeah. You know, I think one of the most probably famous stories is that my father was discovered, and he auditioned for a producer in Hollywood, and he ultimately got the role of Cato in The Green Hornet. And then after the show was canceled, he continued to try to work in Hollywood and was having a really tough time of it. A really hard time getting parts. You know, over time, he was actually up for a lead role in a TV series and was told, you know, they couldn't have a Chinese man as a lead on a TV show in America. And so he was constantly sort of like hitting his head up against this wall and being told, you know, you can't be a star in Hollywood. That wouldn't be accepted by American audiences and all of that. And at some point, he had to make a decision, because he wasn't just going to say, give up. He wasn't just going to say, oh, you're right, okay, I'll just go back to doing something else. Because he'd already sort of set a goal for himself. And so he said, well, what's the way around this rock or this boulder that's landed in the middle of my stream, right? And so he went to Hong Kong, and he took a trip there and sort of got the lay of the land, and he discovered that, you know, he had been a child actor a long time ago in Hong Kong when he was growing up there, and now that he had been on this American TV series, he was sort of seen as this hometown guy who had made it in Hollywood, even though we know he hadn't really made it.
Not yet.
Not yet. And but there was interest in saying, oh, well, why don't you come back to Hong Kong and do some movies here? And so he thought, well, this is maybe the way I have to go. I mean, he looked at somebody like Clint Eastwood, who had to go to Italy and make the spaghetti westerns in order to have some fame and notoriety in order to be able to come back and have a career in Hollywood. And so he thought, that's what I'm going to do. And so, like water, he just sort of flowed around. He found another way, and that's what he did.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine if his metaphor was like an axe versus water, he would have tried to like hit it. You know, like a lot of people try to, you know, they ram their head against it. They take a very kind of aggressive, offensive, thinking that that kind of force is the way to get through.
Yeah.
But I like, you know, his notion of how this kind of the most soft and supple thing ultimately becomes the most powerful and, you know, hardest thing, the most powerful force, that he's kind of playing with those ideas too.
Right. Yeah, for sure. You know, he had this thought about water too, that he noticed that water itself, if you strike at it, if you punch it, it doesn't get injured, right? It doesn't.
It moves out of the way.
It moves out of the way. Yeah, exactly. And so he really took that into effect for himself as well.
Well, so I know this idea of, you know, even water and emptier mind, all this kind of stuff is in the soup of, you know, kind of thousands of years of Asian philosophy that he grew up in. But you know, this is an idea that sometimes it doesn't hit you the first time you hear it, and even for Bruce Lee, it didn't really sink in the very first time or even the second or third time because he was this kid. So I know there's this great story about when he actually had his aha moment about the water. Would you just give us a background of when, you know, he might have started learning about this, but then when he actually got it?
Yeah, so my father started training in Wing Chun Kung Fu when he was 13. And his Sifu was a man by the name of Yip Man, who they've made all these movies about in China. And he was a very sagely man, and he was constantly talking to my father about not being too rigid and not going against his nature, but following his nature and flowing with nature. And he would talk about how sort of the natural world and Kung Fu were very similar, and how as a martial artist he needed to try and incorporate this into his style. And you know, he was constantly being told, no, you're too much yang, you're being too forceful, you're being too rigid. It's not just about punching and kicking. You have to flow with your opponent. You have to find those small cracks and crevices and be able to sort of weave your way around. And he was constantly telling him this. And so at one point, when he was a few years older, his Sifu got sort of, finally had it with him. He said, go home. Don't come to class for a week. Think about it. And so he left, and he was out. He decided to take a boat and go out into the harbor, and he was drifting on the water in this boat, and he had his hand over the side, trailing in the ocean. And he was getting really frustrated with himself. Like, why couldn't I get this? Like, what is he trying to say to me? I don't understand. and at one point, he, smacked the water really hard with his hand. And then all of a sudden, he was like, wait a minute. I just hit this water, and yet the water moved out of the way when I did that. And so then he sat up, and he reached in, and he, grabbed the water with his hand, and it just kept, going through his fingers. He's like, I'm trying to grasp this as much as I can. Even if I put it into my hands and hold it there, at some point it finds its way through the cracks, and I can't grab it, I can't hurt it, and yet it's this soft, supple thing, but it can be the most powerful thing if you think about a typhoon or a giant wave, right? It can crash and smash on you, and he just suddenly had this epiphany, oh, that's what he's been trying to say to me.
Well, it's interesting that you say that when he was taking this kind of hard-headed approach with himself, that it just wasn't working. Sometimes we get really aggressive with ourselves and almost talk to ourselves like this taskmaster or dictator, whatever horrible things you might say, you have to get this, you're not getting this.
You beat yourself up.
You beat yourself up. All of us do that, and it's everybody has that awful voice in their head. And it was almost when he was just I kind of imagine him just relaxing on this boat with his fingers just trailing over the edge of the water in this almost kind of halfway dreamlike state. And then he was open in this kind of what we talked about, this neutral place without trying to force it. And in that openness, he had that moment.
Right. It's like the very beginning of the phrase, we just talked about, empty your mind. When your mind is